you very much, Professor Trudgill, for a fascinating talk, and I'm sure we all look forward to the forthcoming edition on this, sociolinguistic typology. Sociolinguistic typology. Yeah. Would you be willing to take questions?
I insist on there being questions.
Are there any questions?
One of the things you gave under A, the relationship of the amount of shared information to the sociolinguistic typology. Obviously, we're not sharing information in the traditional way, face-to-face, but we're sharing more information than ever in other ways. What do you think the impact and the importance of that is?
That's an interesting question. It depends on what the information is, I suppose, and how... I mean, one point about the internet is there's lots of shared information, but you don't have any information about who you're talking to very often. Okay, so that... I mean, it's not... I think face-to-face contact is what counts in this type of situation. But, I mean, in particular, things, deictics, spatial deictics, are not going to be any good in much internet communication. I mean, I don't know, is the answer to your question, but I would have thought that it's kind of the wrong sort of information, if you see what I mean. But yeah, it's worth thinking about. Thank you for I hadn't thought about that, so thank you for mentioning it.
My own work is in modern Semitic languages, and there's one phenomenon we find in the world of Arabic dialects and modern Aramaic dialects, is that there's a distinction between dialects both in rural areas and those in urban areas, and this sort of seems to correlate with your hypothesis here that. Certainly the rural dialects tended in principle to be more complex in their greater system, and there are more complex paradigms in terms of gender distinctions in verbs, for example, than the urban dialects. But it's not really a case that we're dealing with different degrees of size of community or different degrees of intimacy, and that these urban societies are usually minority groups, like Jewish communities embedded within large sort of Muslim society, which are highly intimate, but embedded within the urban sort of society. But there is definitely a trend that they are less complex. The paradigms are more simplified.
Now, I mean, that would tally, because that would be the contact, the contact versus isolation piece. They're in constant contact with. I don't know about the nature of the contact, but if they're enclave communities, I mean, in urban areas, you more or less inevitably get more contact and looser social networks than you do in other places. So that would make sense. The interesting question historically is that because they have lost the complexity that used to be there? I think it sounds like you're saying that that's right. Or it could be that the rural communities have added complexity that originally was not there. I mean, I don't know anything about this personally, but from my reading of work on Arabic, there seems to be a strong suggestion you can say that for some varieties of Arabic, it's very clear that you get Arabic pidgins, of course, but you get some varieties of Arabic are quite clearly more simplified than they used to be, and that seems to be the result of the Arabic diaspora, the massive amount of contact, and the learning of Arabic as a second language that went on, particularly, say, in North Africa. And examples of spontaneous complexification, as I understand it in the work of Bruce Ingham, he's described additional complexification developing in Central Arabian Peninsula amongst small, tightly knit tribal groups who have not had much contact with anybody outside the community at all. So that, I mean, this all tallies, it all fits in.
Yes, I mean, I think contact is definitely a phenomenon. But just one other point I'd make is that in general, for instance, the modern Aramaic dialects, when you compare them with early Aramaic, they have become definitely more complex. They've developed tenses which you don't find in early form of Aramaic. But in this case, this particular phenomenon does seem to be contact-induced, in that it comes in through contact with the Iranian languages.
Yeah, okay, so they've been living alongside Iranian speakers for generations.
Has increased complexity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a very nice example. Of course, the linguistic areas, Sprachkunde, a very good example of this, of languages transferring categories backwards and forwards between each other. What Joanna Nichols says is that language contact produces additional complexity in all the languages which are in contact. From her, her long-term co-territorial contact perspective. So that's very interesting. Thank you.
If I could ask one thing, actually, I was referring back to your 2004 work on globalization and the idea that there's a reaction against these impulses, so this loss of intimacy. People, to some extent, react against this and they look inwards, and we see an upturn in micro-regional identity, and as a result, the kind of proliferation of languages. I was wondering what the ramifications of this reaction against homogenizing forces would be for your theory.
That's a very good point. It's a very good question. Thank you. I think, in terms of linguistic structure, actually none. What I've been talking about is vowels and consonants and grammatical structures and so on. You were quite rightly reminding me of something that I'd forgotten about. The point that I made when I was giving a talk here in Cambridge some years ago about this, the point being that there seems to be a counterweight, a counter movement to globalization, which is localization, which is called by sociologists glocalization because it's localization on a global scale. So they say everywhere you see this happen. And what this has led to is an increase in the number of languages in the world. But of course, it hasn't really. Okay? It hasn't led to an increase in the number of language varieties in the world. It's led to an increase in the number of varieties which are now calling themselves languages. All right. So, of course, that's leaving aside the suggestion by Bob Blust that it is open to communities to deliberately change their language. I think we all agree that's a very unusual thing to happen. That's amazing and fascinating, but we're not particularly interested in it because people have done it on purpose, and therefore, there's nothing to explain. They just did it because, for whatever reason, there's nothing to explain in terms of linguistic change. So linguistic change as such, whether it's simplification or complexification, is beyond human control, generally speaking. So languages change through time, and they change because speakers change them. But speakers don't know they're doing it, and they don't do it on purpose. So those of us here in this room who are native speakers of English are personally responsible for the way in which the English language has changed and is changing. But we don't accept responsibility for it because we didn't know we were doing it, and we didn't do it on purpose. So I think with this particular, you're talking about a very interesting, or you remind me of a very interesting reaction, but this is the result of conscious human behavior. And because humans, by and large, aren't really able to influence linguistic change, what you could say, well, we here in Galicia are different people from the Spaniards, and we're therefore going to use different vowels and consonants and grammatical structures to make our language more and more unlike Castilian. Now, you do see that kind of thing happening on a relatively minor scale, particularly in dialect contact. But what's going on here, of course, it's a lot easier to say, okay, some people have said that Galician is a dialect of Spanish, some have said it's a dialect of Portuguese. We're saying it's a separate language, and this is our conscious political decision, and we're going to give it all the trappings of a separate language and make sure it is regarded by everybody else as a separate language. And then everybody else in all the other regions of Spain want to do the same thing, and they're all jumping on our dialect is a language bandwagon. So that's a different kind of situation. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I just wondering, do we not see people capable of maybe not engineering the future direction of the linguistic variety which they themselves speak, but certainly having a role in their own linguistic choices at both conscious level in terms of perceptually salient features and a semi-conscious level in terms of the impact of socio-economic class that's been well documented by Bove and others?
Yes, we have to assume there's what sociolinguistics tells you and social psychology is that although learning a language, your native language, is deeply automatic and beyond your control. I mean, you don't see 3-year-old children refusing to learn language. No, I'm not going to do it, no. We are genetically programmed to learn the language or languages which surround us as infants, and we have no say in the matter at all. But on the other hand, and of course major syntactic change going on for centuries, the great vowel shift. The great vowel shift didn't happen because somebody decided it was going to. On the other hand, sociolinguistics tells you that speakers are not just automata. I mean, they're not even sociolinguistic automata. So there is a certain degree of individual choice here. But I think you're right when you're saying it's a kind of subconscious awareness. I don't know how valid a concept that is for psychologists, but you can be aware of something. You can be totally unaware of something, or you can be consciously aware of something, but you can also be subconsciously aware of it. And there's some hypercorrection, of course, is an interesting example. But I think even more interesting are other forms of hyperadaptation, like the famous Norwegian dialectologist Amund Larsen, working in the early 20th century, came up with the term he called neighbour opposition, where something funny, a series of sound changes took place in a particular Norwegian dialect which were inexplicable. I mean, they weren't weird changes, but you just ended up with sort of totally unetymological forms. And I won't bother you with the details because I can't remember them. But basically, there was a kind of proportion. So there was a group of lexical items in this dialect which had this particular vowel in that dialect for perfectly understandable philological reasons. And then there were a group of words where both dialects had the same vowel as this one, all right? So you had two lexical sets, vowel A and vowel B, and then vowel A and vowel A. And what happened was that here, vowel A turned into vowel B. The point was somebody somewhere along the line had set up a kind of equation. They say this, we say that. So if they say this, we're going to say that. So we can't say that that's conscious, but there must have been some degree of awareness of what was going on. So you can say there was a motivation. The motivation there was to sound different from the people who were on the other side of the hill. Now that's unusual. I mean, you're all aware of Le Beau's famous Martha's Vineyard study, where he pointed to a fascinating reversal of a sound change by people who were, as it were, objecting to newcomers and reversing the direction of linguistic change by going back to an earlier pronunciation, an earlier degree of diphthongization, which set them apart from the newcomers. And very fascinating, one of the earliest pieces of sociolinguistic research. But as Le Beau will tell you himself, this is a very unusual event. Linguistic change is hardly ever the result of that kind of phenomenon. It does happen, and where it happens, fascinating, and it made Bill Le Beau famous, and we're all grateful for that. But to have a sort of social motivation for a sound change of that relatively overt type to do with identity. There's a great deal of talk in modern sociolinguistics about identity and its vital role. I don't think it has a vital role, really. Identity does have a role to play in explaining some types of linguistic development, but mostly it doesn't. My view. And Le Beau agrees with me. Or I agree with him, that would be the polite thing to say. But thank you. Good.
Any questions? Any other questions?
I'd like to ask about, you mentioned that with languages of bigger communities, of huge communities like Mandarin, has less complex systems, which is quite obvious. But it might also be interesting to look at the features that it does, the rarer features that it does preserve. Like, for example, the first thing that comes to my mind is that Mandarin does have inclusive and exclusive first plural. And why should it preserve it?
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with this work is, and this annoys people, because I always wriggle out of this by saying that what I'm talking about is probabilities. And of course I am. I mean, that's inevitable. I'm not saying this will inevitably happen in this type of sociolinguistic situation. What I'm saying is that, I mean, for example, I'm not saying that small isolated communities will necessarily produce complexification. I don't think, you can't say that. I think it's a necessary condition for complexification to occur, but it's not sufficient. And the reverse applies, of course. And what you would say is, well, Chinese has this. I've no idea. Probably somebody here does. But one imagines that this developed in Chinese long ago, as the Greeks say. It developed long ago, when it was the Chinese-speaking community was smaller, and it hasn't been lost. That's what you'd want to. That's what I'd want to say. I have no idea if it's true. So it's a matter of the sociolinguistic typological perspective talks about the providing the necessary social conditions, and I think we can say that some things are fairly inevitable. If you have large-scale second language, adult second language learning, you're going to get simplification. Now, what that means for the history of the future of a particular language and whether you still want to call it the same language or not is a very complex situation. English is being learnt as a second language massively around the world by many people, including some of the people here. But it seems to have had no implications or no important implications for the mainstream English language itself. But yeah, I mean, basically, I have to come clean and say there's in the work that I'm doing. Well, I'm not even coming clean. I mean, it's been obvious to me all along. In the work that I'm doing, there are no statistics. There's no sampling. I'm not trying to prove anything mathematically. This is all a big thought experiment, if you like, to think about what may have happened and what is likely to happen. Yeah. So there's no way I would say that a very large language like Mandarin is not going to have any complexity. Of course, it does. Okay. I would say that it probably has less than it used to have. That would be the thing to say. It's much easier to talk about these things relatively than absolutely. But that's a good point. Thank you.
I have just a question about kind of some of the. I think you made sort of distinctions about the sort of complexity that maybe you might get with long-term co-territorial contact.
Yeah.
The kind of thing with these small groups, and also just more generally between simplicity and defining complexity. I just had a couple of questions to ask about how does that mean there's for example, with sound change, one of the things you said about sound change was, in a small tiny community, the kind of complexification we get is lots of sound change.
Well, yes, I did. I think perhaps I did say that. I didn't really mean to say that. I said that you're more likely to get complexification in small tight-knit communities, and the sort of complexification I've been talking about seems to depend, these mature phenomena that Dahl talks about, it seems to depend on, what I should have said, it seems to depend on things like, things like grammaticalization, fusion, reanalysis, in which sound change plays an important, in which phonology plays a large role. That's what I really meant to say. So you don't get fusion unless phonetic material starts disappearing and assimilation takes place and so on. That doesn't mean to say that I've got nothing to say about sociolinguistic typology and phonology, because I think there is quite a lot to say. You start off from obvious point, like pidgin languages tend to have very small vowel systems. And it seems to be the case that in small isolated communities you're more likely to get the proliferation of complexity in terms of the number of consonantal distinctions made. Languages with 80 consonants and so on. One would guess that took a long time to occur and so on. So there and some languages have very symmetrical. Most languages in the world have very symmetrical vowel systems, but there's languages which have very odd vowel systems. For example, languages with 5 vowel systems. If you say a language has got 5 vowels, everybody knows it's got I, E, A, O, U, and that's 99% true. But there are some languages which have I and A, but no E. And they have U and O, but they also have an U. You know, I'm trying to do a back unrounded vowel there. And there again seems to be a tendency for these phonologically odd languages to be small Amerindian languages or Australian Aboriginal languages, whatever. Sorry, I haven't answered your question, I guess.
Well, I think you haven't answered. Can I kind of ask a follow-up? You've said, again, this kind of question of contact, you said what we tend to get with the long-term kind of complication is additive
Yes.
kind of stuff versus the kind of stuff that we get in the smaller type of...
Spontaneous, yeah.
Spontaneous. But again, I'm kind of... if I didn't know anything about the history of a language that acquired a dual, let's say, could I tell, without knowing, that this was the result of a small community, or the fact that they just lived next to someone who had a dual and born?
No, I don't think you could. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that Eichenwald does in her book on evidentials, for example, is to look at a particular language and see how did these evidentials develop. And you may find that some of the particular cases, some of the particular categories developed spontaneously through grammaticalization of verbs of seeing, for example, or verbs of hearing. And others were borrowed from neighbouring languages which had a category that they didn't have. It seems, I don't know if you have any experience of this, but it seems that people who speak languages with evidentials are very unhappy when speaking languages which don't have them. There's really sort of strong pressure to how can you say that without telling everybody how you know that kind of thing. So you can see how they would be borrowed from one language to another. But I think synchronically you couldn't really tell, as far as I know. Good point.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on sort of the implications of this for people who are actually actively doing language revitalization. Because it seems like, assuming this is right, and that certain kinds of language are not going to do too well if they're taken out of their sort of their natural social habitats. So languages with enormous numbers of pronouns just kind of depend on that sort of society to an extent to go on. It seems that means that the task of language revitalization becomes massive. It becomes not just, look, you just have to keep on speaking this language. It becomes, you have to change the way you live, you have to change the type of society that you live in. And I just wanted to get any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess that's an important point. I mean, I don't really want to pronounce on that because it seems to be going way beyond any competence I might have, but that's a very interesting point. I mean, that doesn't mean, obviously, that we shouldn't try, that we should abandon language revitalization. Most of us, I think, would settle for a preservation of Khoi languages, even if on the way some of the pronouns went missing. Okay, well, this is the best we can do. Okay, we'll go for that then. We'll settle for 21 pronouns and not 31. Yeah, but I think that I would hope that this insight would help. That if it is true that some things are more likely to survive in small, intimate communities, well, we can't imprison people and say, no, you're not allowed to go out, not allowed to move to the city. But it might be, more and more important to ensure groups of native speakers communicate frequently and facilitate that kind of activity. But I don't know. But I think that's a deeply important question. So thank you for raising it.
On the subject, actually, sorry if I'm just stealing, of language revitalization and the implications of this, with the idea that these processes of simplification are occurring largely as a result of demographic shift or demographic fixity and the nature of these communities, and in terms of the implications that socio-linguistic typology might have for revitalization, if we were to say that, okay, well, removing these languages from their natural habitat it's going to really complicate things. Are we not kind of teetering dangerously on the brink of prescribing one language is just more difficult to learn as an L1 than another?
I don't know, are we?
Are we? I was just wondering what you thought.
Yeah. Prescribing, you said?
Oh, well, suggesting. Proclaiming.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, if we'd like to hang on to linguistic complexity, we try and engineer situations where small children learn more complex languages rather than less complex languages. Is that what you're saying?
Just in terms of its ramifications for revitalisation
Yeah,
process?
yeah, okay, yeah. I don't know. That hadn't occurred to me as being an implication, but I think again, you keep raising all these very important questions which I haven't got answers to, but I think I'd prefer to leave that to the language revitalisation people. Yeah.
I'm sure they'll look forward to discussing it whenever the book is released.
Thank you very much.
So,
Oxford University Press. It'll be colossally expensive, I'm sure. If you'd like a pre-publication version, just send me an email message and I'll email it to you. All right? Don't tell OUP.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we'd like to thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
being here all night if we could, but